Good morning, guys, and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium. It is the morning of February the 11th, 2020. I had a little bit of time this morning. It's pretty early in the morning, but I finished up a little essay, and I think I've got just enough time to record it. Now, I've entitled this essay Reclaiming Romanticism as a Technology. I have a different title in the document, but the title is not really important. The important thing is that the idea is I've been sort of working through and grappling with how to view the Romantic movement, especially as a modern conservative. And my thesis, and maybe feel free to disagree with this, but my thesis is that Romanticism in and of itself is something that can actually be harnessed and sort of given its historical contingencies, I feel like it's been a tool of the left. But you can see how it's possible to sort of do a jujitsu move on Romanticism and sort of use its own weight against it. And so that's kind of the tone of the essay. So I'm going to jump right into it and not give any more preamble because, of course, I don't want to run late this morning. But know that that's the background of the essay. So this essay was more or less prompted by a conversation I had with a professor of mine the other day. We were talking in large measure about Romanticism. The occasion was this. I was frustrated in my attempt to make any sense of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. This, of course, this famous poem, it tells the story of a fantastical sea voyage about a sailor that shoots an albatross and brings ruin down on the crew, the ship, and himself. There are several different meanings that popped up all at once, and none of them seem to satisfy the narrative. Although I think the best reading is probably a semi Christological sort of transcendentalist, nature loving sort of interpretation. Uh, where, but when I was reading the poem, I thought at least that it was a lot like Leaves of Grass. It contained a procession of pretty pictures that were knitted together loosely by a thin moral. So, be nice to nature or something. Romanticism is actually a frustrating branch of literature for me, and not for the reasons you might think. I'm naturally drawn to medieval and Renaissance literature, not because it's necessarily more comprehensible to me, but because it is more orderly and comprehensible to the people it was written for. You may think you understand what's going on in More's Utopia or in Chaucer or Boccaccio, but you really don't. At least you don't get it like they would have gotten it. Somewhere along the way, there is some fundamental kind of break in the human psyche, and it seems to become most apparent with the Romantics. It may also be a good time to note I'm speaking about Anglosphere literature. The continent is its own beast. Anyway, with that caveat in place, I go on to ask, so what is Romanticism? I think Romanticism is fundamentally a turning away from the exterior and into the interior. I think it would be a mistake to say that the Romantics were obsessed solely with the subjective, because I think they were, in some measure, attempting to describe things that were real and outside of themselves, like the torments of love, family curses, nature, and so on, in a way that makes sense given the kind of thing they are describing. For all men have experienced love, but you don't experience an abstract form of loveliness. You love a particular creature or a thing for your own particular reasons. It would be a mistake also to say that the Romantics are interested in all aspects of the interior life, because they have a particular aversion to the rational faculties, a kind of interior sight which they cast aspersions on as an enemy of the sentimental matters of the heart, which, so far as I can tell, they identify with the real. A good case study in Romantic thought, I think, is the preface that Nathaniel Hawthorne gives to his House of the Seven Gables. In it, he distinguishes between a novel and a romance, primarily by making this distinction. A novel is a work which, in staying true to life, elucidates a kind of flavor or texture of a particular point in time and space, while a romance dislocates itself from time and space using history, sometimes as a window dressing to represent the real. That is, timeless experiences common to all men. And I think, this bifurcation in novels and romances um, For an example of a novel that abides by this bifurcation, I would look at Defoe's Moll Flanders, which is sort of an early proto novel. Needless to say, the bifurcation Hawthorne employs there is no longer in use. What Hawthorne calls the novel and the romance are now indelibly linked, and a work of fiction can tend to one or more polarities, of which the two impulses he established are but two among many. There are also some hobby horses of the Romantics, most prominently their love of nature and exaltation of the natural world as a great teacher. You may recall that Jean Jacques Rousseau believed that children should forego standard education for a few years to undertake a, quote, education in the natural world. The Romantics ran with that idea about as far as they could, buoyed by coinciding Enlightenment philosophies like tabula rasa. The Romantics are heavily nostalgic, particularly for Edenic golden ages, in the same way that some neo pagans are today. There is, of course, Wordsworth's famous sonnet, The World is Too Much With Us, wherein he laments that he is not a pagan suckled in a creed outworn. In equal measure, they are fascinated with the medievals, in part likely for the same reason we are. There was already a huge gap in modes of thinking between the 1300s and the 1800s, but also for the aesthetics of the Middle Ages that we find compelling: Gothic castles and cathedrals, chivalric knights, courtly ladies, and so forth. All of this communicated a crisis in modernity, a crisis usually expressed by the Romantic period writers in their naive socialism and zeal for revolution, fed by their tabula rasa convictions, but also the very real damage that unmitigated capitalist excess was doing to their societies. Industrialization in England was particularly destructive to human persons, as machine breaking was a capital offense, and there were no shortage of clashes between disgruntled workers and the army. Finally, you might say they're untowardly interested in the exotic, the mystical, the imaginative, and in the creative potential of childhood and the value of childhood innocence. This is likely one aspect of Romanticism that influences us today more than any other. Before the Romantic period, people were not sentimental about their children. That is not to say they did not love their children, but their love was not necessarily accompanied by the outpouring of sentiment and emotion that we associate with parenthood in the modern era. Moreover, we are so removed from such an understanding of childhood as that which the pre-moderns would have that we assume our understanding of childhood to be universally applicable, and then we project it back onto peoples of the past and wonder why they were so cold to their children. Children were not seen as possessing any kind of special insight on the world. As a matter of fact, it was the opposite. You may remember the old maxim, children should be seen and not heard. Most people have a kind of natural aversion to this truism. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself, why? Not only has the romantic picture of childhood been so imprinted in our psychology that we think it a natural part of human relations, but it has even given rise to a whole new class of persons: preteens, young adolescents, adolescence itself. These terms have no meaning in pre modern society. You are a boy, then you are a man. There is no gradient along which one wavers between adulthood and childhood. The Romantics indirectly dynamited the rite of passage model in favor of the enculturation model of adulthood which we experience today. This and a myriad of other complaints I could level against the Romantics, but so what? Did their revolutionary zeal become the fountainhead of a great deal of anti traditional movements in the 20th and 21st centuries? Of course. Did their paradigms of psychology give rise to theories like those of Sigmund Freud, or at the very least present a garden with fertile enough soil for them to grow in? Undoubtedly. Have their notions of the individual's relation to society, of tradition and ancestry, of nobility and hierarchy, and of a million other facets of human living contributed to the utter destruction of pre-modern modes of thought? I would answer yes. However, two things must be true at once. Just as, after a great fire sweeps through a city, that municipality will never again have quite the same character as it did before, so too will human thought never be the same after the 19th century. And how could it? Leave aside the literature, the material conditions have changed so radically that the London of 2020 is completely unrecognizable from the London of 1820. It is not the same country. Still England, maybe, but not the same England that vanquished Napoleon at Waterloo, that won the victory at Trafalgar, or that commanded an empire on which the sun never set. Well, what has changed? Romanticism has given way to modernism, has given way to postmodernism, which, though many consider a boogeyman, I merely consider to be a revelatory posture that many contemporary people take towards the shattered mess of a culture that arose out of the First World War, which the modernists apprehended. Postmodernism is less of a thing in and of itself and more of a posture, as I said, that of making snow angels in the rusted junk and refuse of European civilization scattered across Flanders fields. Here's the problem for we who style ourselves traditionalists. The natural impulse is towards the antiquarian extreme, i.e., because things are bad now, everything was good back then, and therefore I should live my life like a museum piece. Nowhere is this on more obvious display than in the most fanatically devoted corners of the so-called Tradcath sphere. A recovery of obscure traditions, especially ostentatious penances and periods of mortification, is common, as well as an irrationally fervent attachment to a purportedly older liturgical form, even though the Tridentine Rite had its most recent revision in 1962. I do not fault them for their zeal, I fault them for their unhelpful attitudes towards tradition. They, of all people, should know that rituals, like sacraments, are outward signs of immaterial processes at work. When a man hands his daughter off to the husband during the wedding ceremony, for example, this is an outward sign of an immaterial thing being passed from man to man, that is, responsibility for the care and security of a mutually beloved woman. Likewise, hand gestures and smoke are merely the wrappings within which a truth not manifest to the senses can be conveyed. Upon that axiom, I think we can come to view Romanticism in a new light. Nearly all isms contain within them some kernel of truth, however small or obscure, that if ferreted out can be of great use to us. Using that truth, then, and wedding it to the truths of the Christian faith in a wider schema, we may come to view this new ism not as a foreign invading ideology, but as a technology for our own purposes. I hypothesize, at bottom, the truth represented in the Romantic movement is both profound and integral to future human society, and it is this: the interior faculties of man, his heart, his soul, his will, aspire to interact with things non material, sublime, and transcendent. Romanticism is, in a sense, a recovery of human mysteries from a mechanistic understanding of spiritual realities, and in its appeal to mystery and to irrational or superrational parts of the man, fortifies this truth against reductive materialism. I would also argue that traditionalist conservatives have already integrated the core of Romanticism in a powerful and productive manner in the prose epic The Lord of the Rings. Unabashedly romantic and yet unabashedly conservative. The former, by its virtue, by virtue of its idealization of nature and human civilization, its plucky underdog heroes, and the overriding sense of unseen hands at work behind the tapestry of Middle Earth and in the very hearts of the protagonist. It is conservative by virtue of its appeal to home and hearth, itself a romantic national ideal, love of order and justice, representation of modernity as the rapacious hordes of the orcs, and most importantly, by its wrapping itself in the shroud of the true myth. A common refrain of the Inklings, or at very least Lewis and Tolkien, was that Christianity was the true myth. That is not to say that myths are false. That is an example of modern biases leaking into definitions of words, which is superseded in equivocation, as Macbeth's porter might maintain, only by the drink. Rather, a myth, at least a very good one, is an attempt by an ancient author to capture a true ideal worthy of being passed on in a kind of story cage, by which it might be transmitted. The true myth, then, is the myth wherein material and immaterial realities reached out from their seeming polarities to kiss one another. That moment was the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Its fulfillment was his death and resurrection. So impactful was it that in all lands where the news of the true myth has taken hold, all subsequent mythology has either been a retelling of this story or a reaction to it. Romanticism has left its mark on Western man, but it need not have warped us beyond all recognition. Indeed, we are no longer capable of a kind of slavish or simple minded devotion to the living deity as we might have been in the Middle Ages, given our compunctions now to free spiritedness and religious syncretism. Yet, let us not pretend that one heart alive with the love of Christ is not worth $1,000 devotees. The romantic impulse, which I have just described, gives us the tools to look past the intellect and the apologetic, as Most within our community are wont to isolate themselves within and speak to the soul, electrifying persons with a transformative nature of the Holy Spirit. Modern materialism has only the tools to speak to the reason and the sense organs of modern man, but we can engage him not only in the head but also in the heart if we allow ourselves the luxury of thinking ourselves in possession of one. True, also, that men and women cannot easily settle back into the domesticity that has characterized the past millennia of human existence. Perhaps we would not want them to. While the excess of the romantic sentiment in marriage is surely something to avoid, let us not tend to the other extreme, that the passions have no place in a happy marriage. How can we expect people in these dark days to bear the cost of marriage and family if it is presented to them as a social duty or chore? How many young men picked up a rifle and headed for Gallipoli or Gettysburg, based solely on their compunction to do their social duty, thus bridling the passions and the desire for fulfillment in the marriage bed to the twin lights of reason and religion, the latter being more luminous, might be precisely the approach that is needed when, in these days, asking young people to wed and have children is depressingly akin to sending them into gunfire. Who has the more cogent environmental vision? The globalist who views natural resources and forests in the abstract, or the Tolkienite conservative with deep heartstrings planted in the earth of his home country? What is a more fit disposition to defend the necessity of the sacraments and the metaphysical truth hidden behind their accidents? The philosopher, the categorizer, the scholar, or the poet, speaking directly to the heart and to the soul? The problems of the Romantics were not their love of the interior life or their idealism, it was their refusal to be wed intellectually to the true myth, the logos that grounds all of reality. And therefore I conclude of Romanticism, paralleling St. Cardinal John Henry Newman, that the heart is the aboriginal representative of conservatism in man. It need only be cultivated.